Hello and welcome to Perennial Podcast episode 17. Our audio has been giving us some issues, so if you could let us know what the quality is, that would be helpful. And how have you been, Ken? How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
Well, I'd be better if the computer was cooperating with me, but I didn't change anything. All the settings are the same. Nevertheless, I don't know, just being away for a couple weeks, maybe that did it somehow. But I'm kind of waiting on. I saw that Sloda was in the chat just before we went on, so maybe he can let us know. But in any case, we have a few things to talk about today. We might want to start just by briefly addressing the Kavanaugh situation. I've been following it loosely. I know Ken's kind of in the same boat there. Okay, so now Sloda says that my end sounds fine and Ken is really loud and could. Okay, so I didn't realize he would be loud. All I have to do is turn my volume down and that should fix it. Okay. But yeah, as for the Kavanaugh situation, I think, Ken, before we started, you were addressing kind of the underlying theme of what's going on, which is a decreasing emphasis on empirical fact, a decreasing emphasis on the formalism of government, and an increasing emphasis on participation in triggering identity groups. And it feels like the kind of scandal that a group of liberal democratic, I don't know, senators or congresspeople, whoever, got together and were thinking, what can we use that will rile people up? What's the triggering accusation? And I wonder what the implications of the sexual abuse and the kind of portrayal of him as this, I'd say frat boy, but it's a high school incident. So I wonder why they went back so far, if it's fallacious, and why it couldn't have been, something that would seem to, betray his character more recently. Because a lot of people, especially on the right, see this and they think, well, it was a high school party, even if it happened as described. I know people who something like this has happened, or they've done something like this, and boys will be boys. But anyway, what's your take on that, Ken?
Yeah, well, either way, if you are on the left and you believe that he's a terrible person, you have to look at the right and say, wow, how immoral they are to just push their person simply because he's on the right, and they're going to deny the truthfulness of these allegations because it's politically convenient for them, and that's the way that they gain power. So they don't care about the moral quality of the representative or the justice. They just care how he's going to vote, how he's going to make decisions, and how that's going to impact the country politically. And if you're on the right, then you might believe that this is a big conspiracy theory, that he did nothing wrong, that these allegations are made up or blown up. Either way, they're going to say that either the facts are wrong, or maybe something untoward happened, but it's not that big of a deal. You're only making a big deal out of it because he's on the right. If this was a left-wing justice and similar things were coming up, I just saw what Bill Maher did, like a comedy special on this. I mean, if it was someone like it was someone on the left, I would think that, at least from the rightist perspective, people would say, oh, you would give him a pass for this. You would say he was in high school, right? So it's the facts, whatever the facts are, I think both sides feel that the other side is just manipulating the facts for the purpose of political expediency.
Right. Now, particularly as to why the sexual assault. Why is sex the focus here, and why is that? Do you think that's particular to an old white male, that would be the most effective way of deterring this? I mean, what would they have done if there was a comparable conservative potential Supreme Court justice who was female? What do you think they would have done?
Well, certainly, yeah. To accuse a female of any kind of sexual misconduct, it just doesn't fly. I mean, it's not. It's not going to be salacious. It's not going to get the press that you need in order to create a controversy. So, I mean, if it was a female, I don't know what they would do. Maybe they would just let it slide. I mean, you look at a guy like Clarence Thomas, who is one of the most conservative members on the court, and he was accused of sexual harassment, but he's black, and so I think that helped in his favor because his whole counter argument, whenever they said, what do you think about these allegations? He would just say, oh, I think it's a high tech lynching. I think this is racially motivated. So I think a woman could do a similar thing. If you look at actually Sarah Huckabee Sanders, she's like this very disliked member of Trump's administration, but I think she gets away with a lot more, and it's a lot easier for her than if it was a male press secretary or whatever her position is, because like the even if the media doesn't like the ideology of that person, the identity politics are so strong that I think that if they're going to have a conservative opponent, that they're happier it to be a woman. And I think like it's a close enough vote at this point that if it was a woman, I think she could get through. Women generally in politics, I haven't seen too many fall due to scandal, except perhaps something like corruption charges, bribery charges. Usually it's something having to do with the husband being in illicit activity, and that takes them down. So as far as like the scandalous, the sexual stuff, although speaking of, if we're on the topic of all the sexual misconduct, it was Paul Manafort, I guess, and maybe this was a month ago, that his whole relationship with his wife revolved around these interracial gangbangs and all this weird stuff was going on. I had no clue. I just caught up on this really old news, and the reason why is because it's not reported in the mainstream. Now, the source is a series of text messages that were leaked from his daughter, actually, who was talking about all this stuff going on with the parents. So it's a WikiLeaks type situation. It's a John Podesta emails type source material. But yeah, all of that stuff, things are obviously going on. And when you look at how close some of these people are to Trump, like it does put things in a different perspective. I mean, there are like verified cases. I think Roger Stone is a very good verified case because I think he was on Bob Dole's campaign, and then he got fired because he put out some ad looking for a man to have sex with his wife in a magazine or something. So, like this is it's not a conspiracy theory. Like there is this high level sexual liberation, you might say, going on at the highest levels. And is Kavanaugh part of that? Is he the good boy that he says he is? And then the question is, does it matter? Do we care? If you're on the left, do you push the point anyway? And if you're on the right, do you just kind of ignore it and look past it or just deny it? And I think people are increasingly less interested in like the individual character of their representatives or justices. They're more interested in how is this person going to vote, ideologically for my group.
You would
and
hope
it's like
so.
this life or death.
You would hope so, but it seems like all of the media circus that went around these accusations actually did sway a lot of independents. A lot of people care about this, which is interesting, where they don't necessarily care about things that are happening more recently. Maybe, looking for someone to have sex with your wife is not a big deal, but groping, somebody when you're a teenager is, which, obviously you don't punish the perverse cuckold behavior because that's actually kind of what they want, what the zeitgeist calls for, in a sense, from men in
Mm-hmm.
positions of power. And the same, like, I mean, look at someone like Justin Trudeau, who kind of lives up to the uh, offered archetypical Western male who's self-flagellatory and constantly apologizing, uh, and sacrificing themselves completely. And yeah, I mean, Brett Kavanaugh is a Chad. It's been observed, and his testimony, I mean, it was very effective and actually did change people's minds according to the betting markets. And I've just been following JF and Nick reporting this, really. So if you have followed what they've said, I'm not coming up with new data, but one interpretation for kind of technically why are they looking for this 1 week FBI investigation? Maybe because they want to find more recent stuff. Maybe they understand that, like, the Republicans, if through the process, the investigation that they've had, these like four possible swing Republican votes, they might not care after hearing what happened and kind of weighing the testimonies. They might still vote for Kavanaugh. But if the FBI investigation can pull up something more recent that speaks more to his current character, then maybe that would make a difference. But this is also just the tactic that they've used with Trump as well, where they keep this investigation open indefinitely so that they basically have all ammunition possible, all ammunition available to assail him. And if you're looking to take someone down, having the FBI, the full resources of the FBI to look into any possible misconduct is obviously helpful. But it's only a week-long investigation, so this will kind of like play itself out, and we'll see. If it only lasts a week, and if they only interrogate or question the people implicated in the story as being there at the party, and if they only look into these sorts of things connected with the accusations, then that'll be it, and my take will be wrong there. But I suspect it's kind of the Democratic MO to keep these things as dragged out as possible, and they do have incentives to keep this until the midterms, until the constitution of the House and the Senate changes. But so last thing on this, maybe that all the technical issues, neither of us are really expert in as to what the political process is that's really going on. But I'm thinking, this really does speak to the whole issue that I've been thinking about lately, because I'm finishing that book on morphogenetic fields. And so the idea is that similar organisms fall into patterns of behavior because they're mutually self-reinforcing. Just like when you play some frequency on a plate of sand or something, or ice crystals, the molecules of sand or water will arrange themselves to correspond to this resonance, that resonant influence. And the way that Rupert Sheldrake portrays it is somewhat, materialistic, and I have my own. It fits into my system in a unique way, and I'm trying to work out the details of that. I'm in a preliminary stage there, but anyway. So the basic idea, though, is that channels of common activity are kind of cut into the collective psyche, and similar types of people, similar races do fall into this. And what we've seen in this increasingly hysterical response is a shift overall in the collective psyche towards a more feminine mentality, right? And that's why the sexual assault? Why would they be going after this? Because it is what hits most strongly the deepest rooted evolutionary instincts of women in particular, which is their incentive genetically. I mean, they can reproduce pretty much without issue. It's just a matter of they want to control who reproduces with them. And so sexual assault and even just pushy men uh, even if it doesn't violate the law. Um, like it's questionable what kind of crime would Kavanaugh have committed if Ford's accusation was correct. I don't know what would he be charged with exactly. It's not rape. I mean, sexual assault perhaps, but anyway, even if things are not illegal, just alluding to someone is approaching me who I dislike, I'm being put in a situation where I'm going to have to be selective in a way that I don't want to. Like, it's as primitive as women just want um, their idealized white knight, their idealized knight in shining armor, and anything that's not that evokes strong emotional reactions. And I think in the background here is the racial issue where why do you attack a white man with this? Because overall, the masculine element of Western civilization, the white male element of this civilization, is being pushed towards that kind of self-flagellatory, self-effacing, cucking uh, direction. And this is almost impossible to explain by mere conditioning because you see the behavior in common people and people who have high levels of information exposure, low levels of information exposure. It's a collective tendency, which that's just how I want to frame it. Where why are we seeing the increasing hysteria? Because the collective psyche is being channeled in a more feminine direction, and it's self-reinforcing in and of itself, not merely as a result of sources of information shifting or communication streams. But the idea is that an isolated person would be kind of moved along by this collective tide. So, now what's your take on that? Do you think that this reflects some kind of general shift in some kind of common field with us as a race, or do you think what's your explanation for the increasing hysteria and emotionalism in politics?
Yeah, I mean that could be an explanation. I think that generally, when you sort of look at transsexualism or homosexuality as an extreme end of a spectrum rather than an isolated behavior, like we tend to think of these things, or in the past, people have thought, there are these discrete categories that you fall into that are mutually exclusive that have nothing to do with one another. But I think there is a confluence between them. So you look at statistics racially, you break it down. White people are not the gayest people, right? Or the people with the most transsexuals. We would think that because when you watch television, you watch news or whatever, it is white homosexuals are vastly overrepresented because they represent this archetype that's been set up by the media of what an homosexual is and what they represent. And it's the interior designer, and it's this person who's witty, and this person who is like has a certain kind of humor and whatever.
Who
I
is the
mean,
gayest? What is the gayest race? If
it's
it's not.
probably blacks.
Oh,
It's
okay,
probably blacks. If
interesting.
I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I can at least invalidate that it is white people,
Okay.
which is what people think because they think, okay, I mean, the story, excluding Asians, the narrative that's sold to us is that white people are the most effeminate, and therefore that they're going to have the most number of gay people. If it's like there's a spectrum, a continuity of like effeminacy and whatever. But as far as men who have sex with men, the paraphilia, the act itself, if you look at something like, say, blood donations, right? They don't use the term gay. They say, are you a man who has had sex with men in the last 6 months? Because a lot of these blacks or Hispanics will say, oh, I'm not gay. They say, well, have you had sex with a man? Well, okay, yeah, but I'm not gay. So it's a different kind of culture of it. Whereas and I did a video of this. I might have deleted it now because it got very bad feedback, but it was just a compilation of clips of black people talking about homosexuality and what was their perspective on it. And they were saying things like, well, it happens, but you kind of keep it on the down low. It's not acceptable in the black community to be gay. It's not acceptable really to be an atheist. These are things that are not in the mainstream. Whereas in the white community, if you're gay and you're an atheist, you're promoted as a representative of the white community. It doesn't mean that gays and atheists, well, in terms of atheism, probably white people are more overrepresented because that's an ideology, but at least in terms of gays, white people take their gays and they promote them to the top as representatives of their race, whereas black people take their gays and they kind of try to keep them in the closet, basically. And so that the outward appearance is that, oh, white people are totally gay and that black people are very hyper masculine and traditionalist or whatever. It's not necessarily the case. So, why is there an increasing emotionalism about politics? It could be due to the changing demographics of the country. And I also believe, and I wanted to make a video about this, is the idea that, and it's tied in kind of with a morphogenetic theory, is that if you have a class, let's say you have a classroom of 20 students and they're all white, but one of the girls is black. You have one black girl in a classroom. And let's say we could go even further and say that, it's 50% male, 50% female, but there's just one black girl. That black girl is going to act very much in confluence with the behavior of the rest of the group. She's not necessarily, and this is like an average case, not, of course, there are individual exceptions, but she's going to go along with the rest of the group. And so if you grow up and you're a kid and you're a student and you're in school and you have like that one black girl in the class, you're not going to say to yourself, man, black people, they're so crazy, they're always acting up, they're always doing all these weird things, because she's pretty much just going to follow the group behavior, just copy and conform to that group behavior. On the other hand, if you have a classroom full of black kids and then you have a minority set of white girls, like let's say you have a classroom full of, and you could even go more extreme, you could say it's a group of 19 black men and then one white female or something. That one white female has to conform to the standards of black culture. She has to start talking black and she has to start dressing black and everything. She has to embody that blackness. And so I think there is an extent to which white people are decreasing in their whiteness, that is their objectivity, their abstract thought, their analytical attitude. They're decreasing in that and becoming more emotional and more hysterical as they are surrounded with more emotional and hysterical populations. The other thing I wanted to mention here was the idea of, if you ask a leftist or someone and you say, do you want white genocide? Do you want to kill white people? They'll say, no, we don't want to kill white people. What we want to destroy is the concept of whiteness. Because what white people, you're fine as individuals, but this whiteness is connected to patriarchy, and it's connected to the destruction of the rainforest, and it's connected to global warming. And so whiteness is bad because it's connected to all these things. I have to ask then, what is the corollary of that? If someone says, well, I don't hate black people, I don't want to get rid of Jews or black people or anyone. I don't have a problem with you as individuals, but the blackness is just attached to too many harmful things. So that's not often turned around, but I think we can think in terms of blackness and whiteness rather than black people and white people, because you see the phenomenon of white people, quote unquote, acting black, or black people, quote unquote, acting white. And I mean, this is something that's well documented and well accounted for. And it's really a question of, what is the dominant narrative? What are the changing demographics? And what do people project into the future? I think it's very powerful when people look at the future and they say, we will become a minority white country. And so there's a sense in which I think whites sort of internalize that, and then they take that projection and it affects their behavior. They no longer feel as if they are living in the current demographics, but they sort of project their psychology forward and react accordingly. And that might mean that they sort of assimilate into non-white behavior, or it might mean that a lot of studies have been done and they've said that white people become more conservative when they learn about demographic projections in their country, specifically the United States. So all of those factors, I think, are changing the emotional tenor of the country and of our culture. And everything is going toward a more hysterical, existential, Eros and Thanatos kind of dynamic. And I'll be back in about 2 minutes.
Okay. So, I, I think that's plausible. On the hypothesis of morphic resonance, it would follow that if you have a higher percentage of, say, blacks who typically act more emotively than whites, if you have a higher percentage of them in the country, then there's more interactions with whites. Um, and that means that the whites that are surrounded by blacks will start to act more black. Now, morphic resonance would say that when a sufficient number of a species or a race starts to behave in a certain way, that'll influence the others. And so it would be a compounding effect that we're seeing the implications of. You can also explain it without morphic resonance, but I think it just helps to think of it that way. So there are a couple comments. Plonky Akanthaster, what's the topic today? We started by talking about the Kavanaugh hearing and its implications for the tenor of politics and how politics has shifted to become more hysterical. And will truth define black, African origin, sub-Saharan African origin, non-Neanderthal admixture. Take any population that has zero Neanderthal admixture, they're black. The lower the Neanderthal admixture, pretty much, the more black they're going to be. But anyway, so the Kavanaugh hearing and its attitude is indicative of this kind of field effect where whites in general are being pulled from their traditional patterns of behavior because increasing numbers of them are being influenced by foreign modalities of behavior. Now, back to what Ken was saying about the effeminacy and of the white race and its relationship to homosexuality. I think that homosexuality is different from effeminacy. You have very high T gay men, and I think there's some kind of an evolutionary niche why you would want to produce gay men, and I don't think it necessarily, you could have a group with high incidence of homosexuality that nevertheless was, on the whole, a very masculine thinking group. I think gay does not equal feminine. And the evolutionary justification for why homosexuality would evolve would be this kind of super female hypothesis. If you have a male who's not competing for the females, then he's kind of outside of the male hierarchy, the hierarchy being particularly designed to facilitate selection, priority selection of females. So they're outside of that hierarchy, which basically, where are they going to fit in? The female hierarchy is more all-encompassing because it places young men and it places women. Women are in charge of both men and women. Men are not in charge of women ever. So the male hierarchy is exclusively masculine. The female hierarchy kind of subsumes some masculine components. And this means that homosexual men, can perform within the female hierarchy, and they typically do. And so, Ken, I was just saying how, or were you able to hear during the interim there, Ken?
Yeah, I caught a lot of what you were saying.
Okay, so what do you think of that then? Just going back to your comment that, it seems like, no, I was pointing to there's a general psychic shift in the white race in particular to become more effeminate. And by implication, more hysterical, and this would explain some of the behavior in the Kavanaugh hearing.
Okay.
Now, and then you pointed out how there aren't as many homosexuals in the white race as some other races, and I think that may be conflating the issue of effeminacy with homosexuality. And then I pointed to like the super female hypothesis of why gays might be adaptive in small numbers. So,
Okay.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you that that's not necessarily the case. So that I think there is a connection between effeminacy generally and homosexuality, but there are exceptions to that. I mean, tops and bottoms, like how do you classify? Are they passive or the active partner? When you look at the ancient world, how homosexuality was conceived, very much it was important if you were the active or the passive partner. It is almost never good. It was almost never considered a morally good thing to be the passive partner, but sometimes it was acceptable to be the active partner. Now, as far as the emotionalism, I think a lot of it has to do with leadership, and I think that if you went to medieval Europe or something, like we can talk about the influence of plastics and xenoestrogens and decreasing testosterone levels, and that is very real. Like the testosterone levels are decreasing to the point where it would be a public health crisis if it was not intentional. So there is a physical biochemical thing going on that is designed, and I think it is designed basically from the top down. I mean, the fact that everything that you buy, if you're just a normal, regular, uninformed consumer, it's all in plastic. I mean, even if it looks like it's in paper, it's coated and lined with plastic. So why is this the case? It's the case because it's been decided to be the case, and it doesn't have to be that way. It could be differently. So I think a lot of it comes from the elites, and then you also think about what was the medieval form of government versus the current form of the government. Well, the medieval form was you had an aristocracy, which was basically defined by its war-making ability. That's how it was established. You became an aristocrat if you succeeded in war and you survived. If you survived the war, of course, there were cases where someone might be ennobled because of their merchandising ability or their artistic ability, the craftsmanship or something like that. But that was the main thing. And so the ability to control your emotions in a wartime scenario, to strategize, to think, that developed a kind of a aristocratic sensibility that was unemotional, that valued continence, that valued temperate behavior. And they're all kind of virtues and values about controlling yourself, self-control. And it's the same with the Kohanim in Judaism, that you follow all these commandments because you want to develop this self-control. Now, today we have democracy, and democracy is basically selecting leaders according to whoever can sell themselves best to the public. And so, I would venture to say that the emotionalism that we see, yes, there is a change in the population, but also if you went to medieval times and you started talking to regular serfs and peasants who were not represented in art, in literature, and in the culture, because it was an exclusively high culture for what we have recorded of it and what was promoted, you could probably get some of those people to be hysterical. You could probably rile them up and get them into a riot or something over some issue of witchcraft or some issue. I mean, there are recorded, for instance, when we talk about medieval Judaism, there were mobs of just peasants and serfs who would sometimes go and they would attack Jews. So they could be made hysterical, they could be made emotional, they could break the law and go outside the bounds of what the norms were. But things were much more controlled by an aristocracy that was interested in how do we control our emotions, how do we, contemplate Christ, or how do we conquer this enemy in battle. The goals were different. Now with democracy, emotionalism and the hysteria of crowds and mobs is viewed as a weapon to be used against your opponents. So that the impulse is to increase that hysteria, to increase that emotionalism. At the same time, there is the Buddhist movement, Western Buddhism, that tries to counteract that and bring back balance and peace and meditation. But the problem with Buddhism is that it's an Eastern system. And so by participating in Buddhism, you're in a way dropping out of the Western society that you're actually living in. If you wanted a contemplative, meditative self-control in Western society, you would have to look towards something like Christianity to get that, but at the same time be participating and have your will voiced within that society. So very much that there's a funneling system where it's like, okay, if you want to live the meditative life, you basically have to drop out of society. You don't get a voice. If you want to be emotional and hysterical, we're going to promote that for the purposes of, democratic elections and getting these candidates in office. And Trump definitely used that. Hillary tried to use it by, saying that like Trump was part of the alt right and why won't he denounce David Duke and whatever. So, you know, I'm sure that in the past, people were, I mean, if you look actually really old, if you want a really old example beyond just the American politics thing, the investiture contest in the 11th century, it was basically the king of Germany or the emperor of Germany wanted to appoint his own bishops without papal approval. The papacy said no, the papacy has the right to appoint bishops. There were disagreements on some things of doctrine, and there were several wars that were fought over it. But you write some of the propaganda, or you read the propaganda that was written back and forth by some of these monks or bishops, and the invective is so strong and it's so powerful. And there's, they're saying like, oh, well, our opponents are engaging in bestiality. And then they would reply, well, you people are, you're cutting up children and eating them. So like these kind of hysterical accusations back and forth are something that comes from within human psychology. It's not something that we've invented in recent years, but it's just the emergence of a latent potentiality that we have within ourselves.
Yeah.
Now, what I feel is that it's being encouraged, it's being pushed, and it's being made mainstream rather than being suppressed, and rather than being exclusive to wartime or something like that. Mm-hmm. Now it's like the normal activity of peacetime is that you're using these kind of fighting words that, from a Germanic perspective, if you make accusations toward people in ancient Northern Europe, you then had the right to fight that person. It didn't matter. It didn't matter if you were the king or you were a slave or whatever. If you accused someone else of doing something dishonorable, they had the right to challenge you to combat. And if you didn't accept the challenge, then you would be exiled. So like we can talk about how, the invective, the hysteria is anti-truth, and it goes against the extreme value on truth-telling that a lot of Northern European populations had before hyper-urbanization.
Yeah, definitely. And it is an innate thing, not something that, like you say, we've invented recently. It's just interesting to see the trends that, whole populations kind of fit in together. And you can explain it by common sources of information. And you can explain those common sources of information by incentive structures. Like you mentioned that the aristocrat of the medieval order was a warrior. And to be a good warrior, you had to have a level mind, right? And this is something I've kind of referred to in the past as not might makes right, but right makes right. Right makes might. So the most virtuous man tends to be the best warrior because it does require that kind of suspension of fear, suspension of concern for the self, participation in the life energy in a very visceral kind of way. Think of like the berserker in Scandinavia. So and that the virtue that's necessary for war is not the virtue that's necessary for the kind of politics we have today. So the incentive in the past was for people to pursue that kind of virtue because it meant raising your social status. Whereas today, having that kind of stoicism ends up being an impediment to your own social progress because A, people don't like you because you're not fitting in with the norms. B, you forego opportunities to acquire fame. We're a fame-based society, very Mediterranean-style fame-based society today compared to the kind of virtue-based society that was more prominent even in Protestant Europe, but Northern Europe overall. So yeah, where you forego opportunities to pursue fame because you have compunction about what you're posting on your timeline. Whereas if you simply post every thought as it occurs to you in a very kind of feminine, just spilling everything out way, that increases the likelihood that you're going to get those metrics up. And the way that we communicate online is very different from how you communicate with a local community, where your reputation sticks with you. On the internet, it's really, the incentive is to put as much stuff out there as possible in as many different venues, also, so that you increase the number of total eyeballs that'll be exposed. And it's just casting a very wide net instead of building like a very compact and well crafted trap. Kind of a weird metaphor, but now Sloda says also it should be noted that a lot of political discourse has totally reoriented itself to be able to be selected as sound bites for radio slash podcasts shows. Yeah, right. Which necessarily means it's oriented to be emotionalized, and it separates having one narrative from people to draw from into media creating several. Right. We used to read newspapers, and the level of diction and just overall quality of newspaper writing used to be much higher. But now people don't read newspapers. They don't generally read articles. High information people read articles today, but even those kind of can't separate themselves from this soundbite culture. We're a very video based culture today. The way we absorb information is in these kind of jump cut killer moments that do really betray or portray the essence of something in the way that a summary report couldn't. Like if someone wrote up details about the Kavanaugh hearing, even if it was 20 pages, it really wouldn't capture a certain feeling in the room that you would have gotten if you simply cut between like the thing that Lindsey Graham was saying, like cut to the most dramatic moment there, a dramatic moment from Kavanaugh's testimony, a dramatic moment from, and it's these moments that are actually retained. Because it's not like text where you're engaging with ideas and absorbing ideas, and then the ideas with high emotional potency are the ones that you retain. It's rather that the experiences that you have with high visceral impact are in fact, remembered. Because that's why you remember things. You remember things that have high emotional value. So, I mean, there's all sorts of a confluence of factors that lead to this emotionalism. It's just really sad when you look back at, you know, speeches from politicians from the 50s, from the 60s, or, if you go back further, the same kind of thing. Although there's a period from the 30s and the 40s where actually it's very, very emotionalized as well. So again, these things move collectively. But yeah, it's really sad when you compare the discourse today to the discourse in like the 1960s for the most part, and just the way people acted, and like watch old, I don't know, Johnny Carson or something compared to the talk shows we have today. It's very discouraging. So anyway, let's I guess segue into some kind of housekeeping for our project, which is deepwrite.boards.net, which is an academy model that's designed to integrate the efforts of people with different interests who aren't within the mainstream academic system, and to combine those efforts in a hierarchical fashion that's nevertheless democratic in certain senses. You can go on the site to look at the details of it, how it's structured. I have a video on the structure of it, but the reason, like why should we be doing this, the reason this is necessary is that academia is controlled by elements that want to destroy our civilization. And academia is, in many senses, the center and source of culture. Ideas begin in that kind of environment. And getting people together in colloquiums and talking together and Sharing research is the kind of productive activity that is not captured by the media landscape that the far right has today, which is very much individualistic, and people are competing. This different far right contributors online are competing for the same viewership and for the same donations. Whereas an academic model is an integrating model, not this kind of market, although we do use some market elements. So that's just a general idea. What are we doing? It's an academy model, and there's some very interesting posts already up there. You could probably spend a few hours reading through it, and we've had good participation. Now we had 2 rounds already. The rounds are structured in 2-week intervals, and the first round went well. Second round went well, and I was supposed to have the roll call for this round the last weekend, but unfortunately, not enough people signed up, and I think that may be because I didn't post the roll call page in a visible enough space, which is why I wanted to mention it here that we are doing the roll call for round 3. Still, it's an open roll call through this weekend, and we'll probably close it on Monday. But yeah, we need to make sure we have enough people participating. And we are interested in your ideas as to how we can improve this, simply because, not because we're making money from it, not because we really have much to gain from it. Actually, it's a huge time drain, and I have a family, and it's work. It's something that I think needs to be done, and that's why we're doing it. But anyway, did you want to maybe highlight some of the most interesting posts from the last round, Ken? And we can talk about them briefly just so people have an idea of what we're doing on the site.
Sure. So for the research group that we have going is for rightist art. Napoleoff had a winning entry with the animated movie Feherlofia, and he writes just a very, I mean, when I had called for research, I had done the roll call for that group, I kind of threw out Feherlofia as something that I was interested in, and then I thought warranted more research. I threw together like a small little video about it, like a 5-minute video. But I just felt there was so much more that could be done with it. And he really went in depth into history, a little bit of etymology, brought in a medieval illustrated chronicle, which I was very happy to see. So it was basically what I would have wanted to write for my entry. He did what I wanted to do, and it was in addition to the objective analysis. Just reading through it, I felt kind of emotionally impacted by what he was talking about. It wasn't just this dry, because I think sometimes you can get too down into the details and it can become dry to analyze. Okay, well, this is the world tree and this is this hero archetype, and like we've seen this a million times before, and here's 20 things I can compare it to. But I felt like by the end of it, that it was the entry that sort of emotionally impacted me the most. So it kind of had the pathos and the logos there, and I'm looking at these entries and I'm seeing the feedback that they get. I'm seeing the conversations that they're starting, and I'm very happy with it as a beginning, because I think that engaging with this kind of stuff, I'm seeing like week to week people improving and people changing their ideas or questioning their ideas. And that's what I want this to be. I want it to be something interactive. I mean, you can go off on your own and you can produce your own research, and you can you can use a platform like YouTube to put out your own thing and say, like, I'm the author and here is the content and you are the viewer. And it's a kind of a one-to-one-to-one stream. And theoretically, you can get in contact with other people, you can do live streams, but that is not a necessary consequence of having your own blog or your own YouTube channel. oftentimes it can become very much this one-to-one back and forth between you and the viewer, where there's this very top-down relationship, and that's not always the most productive thing. With this model, having these distributed nodes, having different research groups, people involved with multiple research groups, you get this cross-pollination. You allow for, both encouragement and constructive criticism. And I think that everyone who has involved themselves with the process so far has learned something new, or they either about themselves or the subject matter, and they've been inspired to undertake this learning in a way and to an extent that they otherwise normally might not do it. Like, you might analyze something you haven't heard before, or you might have been interested in it in a passive sort of way, but now you're actively engaging with it. And really the best way to learn something is to be forced to teach it to other people. And so that's kind of what it is. You're here, you're making a presentation, you're trying to teach other people what something is about. And that can be a very specific piece of artwork, or it can be something very general about, organization or metaphysics, or we have the colloquium for very general topics, choose your own topic. So yeah, I'm very happy with what's going on, and it is a question of quantity versus quality. On the one hand, I could just go out there and spam. Like, theoretically, I could, put up an advertisement or spam the forum everywhere and try to get it really well noticed. But one of the things I've liked so far is that you've had people, I noticed when you put out that video on organizational structure, and we had some people responding like, hey, what's the point of this? Why are you even bother? What's your telos? What's your goal? And it was just this endless criticism, and those people haven't joined the forum because almost, I think in a way, they're too afraid to actually engage with it. For when whatever that fear might be, I'm not sure. It could be a number of reasons. But some people just engaged with it openly, honestly, in a genuine manner, of various skill levels and various backgrounds. It's not a homogeneous population, but they're just coming in and they're trying to make it work, and they're trying to discover and explore the meaning of what a right-wing academy would look like from this most general perspective. And it's just been a lot of earnestness and people really willing to experiment. That if you did really cast a wide net and try to get all sorts of people in, then I can see the situation where then you would start to get lower quality people, or people who were just there to push their own thing rather than being open to feedback and communication and evolution and stuff like that. So yes, it is small, and of course we would like to expand and get bigger. But there is also an advantage to being small that I'm grateful that we're able to start off like this.
Right. One of the main problems with being so small, I believe we have 9 consistent contributors, is that when people drop out, and they inevitably will, all organizations lose members no matter their quality. Mm-hmm. So when people drop out, you really need an input stream, which is why hopefully we can discuss it on here. And we do need to grow this stream. Today was kind of okay. We had the technical issues with the audio not being able to be, what we've had in the past. And then, neither of us were really researching the Kavanaugh thing to discuss it. We just kind of pulled it out to talk about something, because we've both been pretty busy. So I went to California recently, and, just my schedule's been very difficult. But anyway, so the other posts from last round, I did one on this book, Principles by Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is the founder of Bridgewater, which is the world's largest hedge fund, and he just has all sorts of really useful principles of management, organization, principles for his personal life. A very systematic thinker, and he uses computers to help in his thinking. Worth checking out, and if you want to check out my article, it's there in the organization section of round 2. And there's a lot to apply from that. But specifically, I think it's interesting that he uses a kind of believability weighted voting system that I actually have been thinking of for years, that I mentioned as early as 2012 on this channel, which is that you want to have an academic system, and his isn't an academic system, but the same kind of principle applies. I wanted an academic system where someone's perceived performance, if it's generally considered of a high quality, then their influence on evaluating other people's work is higher. So you want to count the votes of people who are more qualified or competent or believable, to use Ray Dalio's term. You want to weight those votes higher. And it's such a basic principle, but not many organizations use it. This is actually the first time I've come across someone who actually uses it, and lo and behold, it's the world's most successful hedge fund. So it's a good proof of concept that that is actually a way to structure things. And it's better than peer review that the academic model uses today. So I think there's a lot of promise in a new kind of academy, and if we get the momentum going, it will be able to outcompete eventually, hypothetically. Just because it's the whole academic system is so dogma based, it is not cross synthetic enough. There's not enough interdisciplinary projects. Now that's increasing lately, but there's still a lot of limitations in that there are certain theories and certain areas of research that people just don't look into. Issues pertaining to race have vast implications for sociology, for psychology, for all sorts of areas of science and the humanities. But the racial question has to be treated in a very specific way in the academic context. Not that we want to simply be racist and be edgy for the sake of it. I think that was a phase that many people in what was known as the alt-right went through, and it was immature, not something to be emulated. But we have to be able to be honest about it, and in a civil way that doesn't invite this kind of hysterical invective against what we're doing. And then the other post that I had for the colloquium section was a new integralism, which is basically what I'm describing now. We need an integrated worldview, and I just kind of I outlined the structure of what that would be in a very general way that kind of directs our attention towards what the starting conditions would have to be and what we need to produce in order to increase that integration. So right now, that's what I'm concerned with. How do we increase the integration of our project, and how do we, slowly start bringing in a trickle of highly interesting and qualified people? Not to discourage someone who perceives themselves to be underqualified, because you have to remember not the Dunning-Kruger effect, but the other effect pertaining to how you perceive yourself. Is it like the Dunning effect? I can't remember. It's not the Dunning-Kruger.
The Dunning-Kruger works both ways, because it says that people who are... Oh, wait, now you're saying it the other... Well,
there's another... The common perception of the Dunning-Kruger effect is not what it is. It's related, but when people say that, like, dumb people don't realize they're dumb, then that's not the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's like this other effect that's closely related, but it has a different name. I just can't remember it right now. Anyway, but if you think that you're underqualified or you don't have anything good to say, odds are actually that you're more qualified than you think. Now, if you think that you are God's gift to mankind and you're gonna fix any organization that you come into, probably you might be more of an impediment. So, and that goes with impulsivity and just general reservation and stoicism being correlated with high quality people. So Will Truth asks, what do you guys think of Baker Mayfield? I'm not aware of this person. Are you?
I feel like I've heard the name, but I don't know them. Apparently, he's a football player. Yeah,
okay.
The whole football player thing. I'm sure if I go to his Wikipedia page and click on controversy, personal life, I guess he was publicly intoxicated in 2017. I don't know what else I'm supposed to
That's
question about his.
pretty wild. Okay. Um, Now, I'm curious also, while we still have people in the chat, what they think of the possibility of using a VR system for the Academy project. Just because I'm thinking of how to increase integration. And one of the classic ways is conversation in real life and spending time together. But it seems like, these VR systems, some of them are actually designed for academic contexts, mostly business contexts, where you're all kind of simulating to be in the same space, and you'll have like a whiteboard, you'll have the ability to pull up documents and interact with media that way. It would be a slight investment. I don't know how much the cheapest systems cost like $20, and the software that you would have to run, I don't know what it costs. It can't be all that high. But anyway, I mean, what's the impression there? Would that be a worthwhile thing to have this kind of VR meeting, maybe once a week, maybe more, maybe have it available at a certain time in the evenings for those who are able to participate? We could also do the same thing with other forms of chat. I just think the VR would be a novelty, and like from my perspective, it'd be something like, hey, I wonder what that's like, and that would be just an extra reason to try and do this. But well, first of all, what do you think of that possibility, Ken? Would you be willing to shell out the $20 to get a VR headset and that sort of thing? Same thing for the people in the comments. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that would be interesting. If it's really only $20 and it's compatible with my computer, and I can just like plug it in, put it on, and see how it works, yeah, I would be willing to try it out. It is. I actually haven't. I've had the opportunity to try those kinds of things out, and I've always kind of passed on it. Maybe I tried the technology when it was a little more new long ago, and I was not particularly impressed with it, but I'm sure it's advanced today. And yeah, I don't know. I'm always in a lot of different areas. I've lagged behind significantly in terms of technology, and that's probably just my paleocon kind of attitude toward life in a lot of ways. But yeah, I would be willing to try it. It would be interesting.
All right. Well, I'll look more into it. Slow to suggest maybe 4 or 5 people could try it and see, how it pans out. And I would like that to set up like a group of the active posters, and get some kind of weekly thing going, just because it'll help to have a less. It'll help to have verbal interaction, real time speech. You just communicate in a very different way in that context. And apparently they had VR meetings in Neon Genesis Evangelion, which I didn't watch, but okay.
I watched it, yeah. I don't remember the VR meetings per se, but I believe whoever's saying that.
Okay.
It's a while ago.
And then, so Sloto was afraid playing Resident Evil on VR, which I'm sure I would be too. That's one of the few games, Resident Evil 1, when they remade it for the GameCube, one of the few games where I was genuinely afraid pretty much most of the time playing it. Probably mostly because like the camera angle was so awkward that trying to control, because they were fixed camera angles. You would enter a room and the camera angle would be up here, and you'd have to try to navigate this room from different camera angles in every room. And the whole setup and trying to aim in a system like that was just not easy. But anyway, I'm actually a big fan of Resident Evil. So I think we've had enough here. I know that Ken has to get to work at some point today, and I have stuff to do too. So, and last, Slota does make a good comment. VR does divorce you from your environment, and it like makes you much more focused on the content, which is true, because I've been in live voice chats with people on the right, and a lot of people are just kind of zoning out, checking out, or doing other things, and then when they hear the conversation turn to something they're interested in, then they jump in, and like the whole thing's not integrated. This is how it goes. But anyway, we should wrap up now. Any closing thoughts from you, Ken?
You know, I usually don't have any. I was very, I don't know, disturbed. Maybe is too harsh for a word, but I put up this guy Carl Willink. There's a video on my channel,
I saw it. It was
and
very
it's on
good.
a post on the
Very good.
forum. Yeah, and I was just people were so like and they were like, "This is disgusting." Not referring to me or my analysis, but they were like, "This guy, he's like disturbing and it's gross, and I don't want to look at it." I'm like, I mean, you live in the modern world. You walk around every day and you see modern art and modern architecture and modern people and like all obesity. You like see things on a daily basis going into Walmart that are far more horrific than what's being portrayed here, in a sense. And it's like I was just kind of taken aback. I'm like, where is the tolerance? And that goes to the question of integration, of people kind of compartmentalizing things and saying like, oh, well, art should only be. And I showed the Dutch Italianate style, that it should only be positivistic. It should only be beautiful and harmonious and angelic and everything. And I was like, well, if that's all you're doing is the saccharine sweetness, then there is a danger there that you are compartmentalizing, that you're going into the world, it's ugly, and then you kind of go home and you kind of appreciate this ideal art, and that allows you to ignore the ugliness in daily life, and you can just escape it into the art. And so I think it is important that we do have negative art, and that there is implicit struggle and conflict in art. And I think that's part of the reason I kind of wanted to respond to people like, hey, haven't you ever seen Jesus on the cross? Like, that's probably one of the most, significant Christian icons. And that is all about negativity and suffering. And it's not necessarily totally beautiful, although there are aspects of like beauty and truth to it. But you see it so commonplace, and you see people just wearing it in a daily and so there is a normalization of that negativity, which I think is healthy, because when the atheist comes along, they say, oh, you like zombie Jesus, and oh, Christianity is too macabre, it's too brutal. And then they go off and they watch, they play Resident Evil and they watch like horror movies or something. People have a need for the macabre, for the horrifying, for things that are disgusting, and it is not a negative thing necessarily to interact with negative artwork. Like, it is I think a healthy thing to express those emotions and to engage with that part of our psyche, which again, it's a potentiality within us, and if we just shun it, then it usually comes out in unhealthy ways, rather than if you just engage honestly and openly, like, hey, yes, this is an aspect of our reality. This is an aspect of my personality. Let's be honest. Let's be open about it. Let's engage with it, rather than say, oh, that's disgusting, I never want to see that. Something like that. I only want to see positive, harmonious art. I think does lead to a lot of negative externalities in a way.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Shostakovich, the Russian composer who lived under the Soviet Union. And his music, it's a little bit different, where there's kind of the undercurrent of distress and like kind of this existential outcry, and you can see it as reflective of the social structure. But it, on the surface, it has these kind of formally recognized like good aesthetic practices under the USSR. But yeah, I like Shostakovich. It's not all harmonious, and it does not all sound like Tchaikovsky. But if Shostakovich had written like Tchaikovsky, he'd sort of have been a liar, right? You want art to depict the human condition as it really is, maybe idealizing it in a way. But the idealization shouldn't be to cover up the bad. It should be to clarify the real, in my opinion. And if you're not familiar with Shostakovich, it's a lot of really, really good music. You should maybe start with like Symphony Number 5. But anyway, I think we've had enough,
Yeah.
and we'll
My last point on
sure.
that was that it's not about. I understand the criticism of realism as this gritty realism destroys our ability for idealism. But there's a way in which you're able to idealize the negative as well. So you can have an ideal form of a dragon or an ideal form of a demon, and you can idealize that and you can have two ideals, negative and positive, rather than just the gritty realism of like there's no such thing as ideals and we're all just like these fallible, simple creatures or something like that. So, last point from me, good discussion, and hope to have another one very soon.
Yep. It'll probably be earlier on Saturdays in the future, and we'll see about maybe doing a couple weeknights. But anyway, thanks for listening, and hope to see you on the forum.